Greetings and salutations, friends. Now, before I get started on the Empire, a bit of a public service announcement. For the coming week and for a little while, I am going to be quite busy with real-life things, so expect some delays in the lore videos. You'll still be getting your weekly lore videos, but they'll probably be concentrated around the weekend, as that's the only time where I'm going to have time to actually edit and do this stuff properly. But I have some stuff that I had pre-recorded, originally planning for when I eventually ran out of factions to do, so I'll give you that to watch during the weekdays, and while you're looking forward to the next lore videos. So never fear, there will be something for you, even though I may not be able to respond to your comments quite as frequently as I've been doing, simply because, well, I'm gonna be busy with, life things. Anyways, on to the Empire. Now, the Empire is the largest and, by direct consequence, the most important of the human factions within the Warhammer world. It is loosely based on the Renaissance Holy Roman Empire of our own world, being more a confederation of individual feudal states united by a common language, Reichsspiel, a common religion and shared cultural heritage, rather than a centralized nation-state. Now, as for their religion, their primary religion is the cult of Sigmar, which is the worship of the living god Sigmar. This cult, or church as they prefer to call themselves, is led by the Grand Theogonist, and below him two archlectors, representing essentially the Pope of the Old World and his rather small College of Cardinals. However, the Empire is far from a single religion nation. The Empire is actually fairly liberal when it comes to its religious policy. While the open worship of other gods is somewhat frowned upon, they are more or less accepted within Imperial society. Of course, you're not allowed to be worshipping the Chaos gods because, well, evil. But the worship of other human deities along the lines of Ulrich and Manaan is perfectly accepted, and since there are rather large colonies of dwarfs within the Empire, and also quite a few High Elves, the worship of both the High Elf deities and the Dwarven ancestor gods is more or less accepted within the Empire. I say more or less because while the followers of the Church of Sigmar, of course, don't take too kindly to this and would much rather see the Church of Sigmar being the only allowed religion, these other religions are not persecuted in any obvious or stately sanctioned way, and are therefore more or less free to go about their daily worship. This does vary slightly from province to province, but for the most part there is religious freedom within the Empire. To the point where some provinces, for example, the Empire province of Middenland, primarily worships the old god Ulrich rather than Sigmar. Though the worship of Sigmar is perfectly accepted, the vast majority of the population still worship Ulrich. And while Ulrich has become much less of a common god in the rest of the Empire, he was a god long before Sigmar became a god. In fact, Sigmar himself would pray to Ulrich, and held him as his own personal god. And while Sigmar is considered much more of a protecting fatherly figure, Ulrich is the god of warriors, viewed as a distant and aloft figure that don't care too much for the machinations of mere mortals. Other than the primary gods of Manaan, Sigmar, and Ulrich, there are several minor deities, along with the dwarfs' worship of their ancestors, of course, permeated throughout the Empire, but most of these are tiny and insignificant things, mostly dating back to when the Empire was a gathering of barbarous tribes rather than a civilized nation. Speaking of the Empire, contrary to what the name might suggest, the Empire is not a hereditary monarchy. It is in fact an electoral monarchy, and although the current emperor reigns until death or until overthrown in some form of civil war, etc., though extremely rarely, I might add, seeing as the emperor is considered to be the chosen of Sigmar and is therefore considered almost a divine entity, so civil wars are very, very rare, although they have happened. But back to the point, the ones who elect the next emperor once the old one is dead are called the Elector Counts, which is a council made up of 16 members, each with one vote, although there is a slight catch. You see, the Grand Theogonist of Sigmar, the Pope, if you will, of the Church of Sigmar, has essentially 3 votes, because he has his own vote as the Grand Theogonist, and he also has, essentially, the votes of his 2 Archlectors. And while it has happened that the 2 Archlectors has voted either individually or in some way in contrast to the Grand Theogonist, either on direct order from the Grand Theogonist, or due to a bit of a rebellious streak, the 3 votes are usually united behind the Grand Theogonist, which means that the Church of Sigmar has an immense amount of political power within the Empire, seeing as they are sitting on 3 times the vote of any other individual. And while the leader of the cult of Ulrich also has a seat on the Elector Counts Council, he only has 1 vote. The other 12 votes stems from 11 Elector Counts and a courtesy vote that is offered to the Mootland. And I say courtesy vote because while the Moot is technically an Empire province, well, it's not inhabited so much by humans. It is in fact inhabited by, well, essentially hobbits, or as they are called in the old world, halflings. And while the halflings offer very little real contribution to the Empire at large, the Imperials have basically accepted them as part of the Empire. And while they are able to draw some taxes from them, although the halflings have become quite adept at avoiding the taxations leveled against them, they have very little real say within the Empire, as they have essentially no real military strength. And as such, their vote usually flips-flops between their various neighbors that are threatening them with varying acts of potential violence, or even worse, an increase in tax collectors, or even worse than that, they might take away some of their food, because halflings, just like their hobbit counterparts, love to eat, usually 7 to 12 times a day. But enough about the hairy-foot savages. The remaining proper Elector Counts all rule over one of the provinces of the Empire, and these positions are hereditary, though they have sometimes been disputed by various claims over titles, so they're not so much hereditary as in genetically hereditary, but they are hereditary as in the title will pass from father to son, etc. So if that title somehow gets usurped, then the next dynasty will essentially take over the title and therefore also take over the position as Elector Count. Now, I'll give you a quick rundown of the various provinces. There is Averland, Hochland, Midland, Nordland, Ostland, Reichland, in which the imperial capital of Altdorf is located, and the capital will move along with the emperor, so for example, if Valmir von Raukov of Ostland became the emperor, then the imperial capital could be moved to the capital of Ostland, or the new emperor could decide to just simply move to Reichland, which is usually the best choice simply because Reichland is a big-ass city, and the sitting emperor is essentially the governor of said city, and as such, he gets to take all of the taxes and various other benefits. But back to the list. There's Sturland, Talabekland, Wiesenland, Solland, Drakwold, and the Mootland, of course. Now, some of these provinces no longer exist, and therefore the Elector Count for that province either is essentially a noble in exile, or his vote has been absorbed by one of the other members of the council. For example, Solund was essentially destroyed as an independent imperial province in the wake of Gorbad Ironclaw's Orc invasion of the Empire, and its territory was ultimately absorbed by the Grand Barony of Wiesenland. And the title, Count of Solund, was essentially destroyed, and as such, the Elector Count of Wiesenland does not actually have 2 votes. He simply inherited the land without the title. Then there's Westerland. Westerland's primary city was the great commercial city of Marienburg that seceded from the Empire in 2429 in the imperial calendar, and became an independent city-state. And after beating the absolute living shit out of an imperial army sent to restore compliance, the Emperor Wilhelm III officially recognized Westerland's independence, and currently exists as a city-state with its own government ruled over by essentially merchant princes, turning it into a little bit of a merchant republic, and exists in more or less peace with the Empire as a valued trading hub, although there are plenty of elected counts that would just absolutely love to take it back, as whoever managed to recover it might have a shot at 2 votes in the Electoral Council, not to mention the fact that it'd have control over an extremely wealthy merchant city. Then there's Sylvania, which many of you might remember from my Vampire Counts videos, and is today technically an official fiefdom of the Grand County of Stirland. Less so by choice than by, well, force, as well. No one really wants control over Sylvania because, well, it's filled with vampires, undeads, and unruly populace, but somebody's got to do it. And Stirland was the unlucky province that got saddled with this particular blind, deaf, and limping dog. The 2 last one is the Drakwold, which was an original founding electoral province of the Empire, but was, well, after being completely and utterly overrun by the Beastmen, simply divided up between Midland and Nordland. Then there's Sudenland, the Grand Barony of Sudenland, which was an electoral province in the very, very, very early version of Warhammer Fantasy, which has later been retconned by Games Workshop, and so has been whisked out of existence by the, gods over at Games Workshop, which are, well, more powerful than even the Chaos Gods, and so we simply do not talk of Sudenland. Which means that the current Electoral Council essentially consists of 11 proper elected counts, including the hairy-toed bastards and the religious fanatics. Now, as for the government of the individual provinces, that is pretty much up to the local baron, or elector count. The elector counts, somewhat confusingly, like to call themselves Grand Barons rather than counts, purely just to piss off anyone actually doing research into this stuff, I am sure. With some provinces being run more or less like a merchant republic, where the Grand Baron just simply skims off the province, to some of them being run as extremely militaristic and controlled nations, like for example Midland. Though, granted, Midland is surrounded by all manners of evil things both outside and inside its borders, so a little bit of discipline is probably a good idea. And then, of course, there's the Moot, which is also technically a bloody province and is governed by a system of, well, food bribery, more or less, with whatever local clan of farmers can ply the local Grand Baron. I really hate the Moot, by the way. With the tastiest dish and thereby gain better landowning rights. It's a silly place. But in essence, the local governor basically decides the rules. Now, there are some common imperial rules, like for example, you shall not worship the Chaos Gods, and you shall not beat to death your neighbor with his wife, and other such things, basic things. Though some provinces have some uniquely interesting little rules pertaining to certain activities of a carnal nature, which I shan't go too deeply into here because while hilarious, they are most certainly not safe for all ages. Let's just say that there is a particular joke about the people of Averland concerning their wives and their local cattle. Something slightly more interesting, though, is that, like I said, all of these provinces are essentially their own little states within the empire. They are miniature nations united by the common rule of the emperor, and as such they have their own standing armies. And this is one of the really interesting parts of the empire, because all of the different provinces have wildly different martial traditions. They also have their own unique color schematics and ways of fighting. Though, of course, the differences are less dramatic than in races like the Skaven or the Orcs, because, well, they are humans and they have to rely on much the same doctrine, but they do it in slightly different ways. For example, the armies of Reichland, being an extremely wealthy province, has vast armies of highly trained, extremely well-equipped soldiers, drilled to fight in disciplined formations, while being supported by extensive batteries of artillery and considerable amounts of gunpowder weaponry, while poorer provinces might have to rely on units of professional soldiers kept trained and equipped by the local lord, supported by peasant militia, and given ranged cover not by the brilliant gleaming artillery parks of Newlyn, but by veteran hunters that act as skirmishers, and at later stages in the battle as good old-fashioned archery support. And this is one of the really interesting parts in a Total War game. Now, I kind of hope that they let us pick which province we want to play, so that if I want to play Reichland, I can play Reichland and only Reichland, whereas where I am essentially forcefully allied with all of the other nations within the Empire, so you can't just randomly declare war on your neighbors, because that's simply not how the Empire works. If one of the electoral provinces of the Empire simply just declared war on its neighbor, more often than not, every single other province would just dogpile the rebellious little bastards. Of course, you could add in a really interesting system of politics where you could maneuver for the throne and either be elected emperor, or come up with some random contrived bullshit political reason to say like, hey, you know what? I should actually have been elected emperor instead of that little bastard because reasons, and thereby maybe making some form of realm divide event a la Shogun 2, where you can actually grab power from the sitting emperor. Could be cool, but on the other hand, implementing all of this is going to be an absolute ton of work. Like, you're gonna have to make unique color schemes for all of the provinces, like that alone is quite a job. Then you need to make individual rulers and family trees for all of the provinces. Then you've got to make unique units for all of the provinces. Then you've got to implement the politics systems, which would essentially only be used for this one faction, etc, etc, etc. It would be an absolute ton of work for the boys over at Creative Assembly, so while I would prefer that solution, I wouldn't be too sad if they just gave us the Empire as one nation. I'd be a little disappointed, but as long as you can recruit units from the various provinces, for example, I want to have my Hochland Long Riflemen, and I want them to be wearing the colours of the Hochland army. I want Ostland Spearmen, and I want them to wear the colours of Ostland, which could create a really, really, really cool looking army, where you have all of these really awesome colourful uniforms from all across the Empire, gathered in this one big, beautiful army. It would be a real magnificent sight to behold. Almost to the point that I kind of want them to do the Empire as a single nation. I don't know, I'm kind of conflicted on this, because as a Warhammer dude, I would really like to play the individual provinces, but as a Total War player, I'm thinking like, oh, yes, that'd be cool, but think of all of the awesome stuff they could do with the Empire as one nation. So I'm not actually entirely sure on that, and I'll be more or less fine whichever way they decide to do it, as long as, of course, they stay relatively true to the fluff. And by all the gods, by Sigma, Ulrich, Menan, and even the 4 evil ones to the north, please, CA, I know that the Empire is offering you the biggest, juiciest possibility of absolute crazy-ass DLC milking you have ever experienced. Like, you could literally sell us color patterns and say like, hey, you want to play as Hochland? Well, give us $10 and we'll give you some fucking colors. I know that must be tempting you right now, but please, please don't do it. Because honestly now, with the stuff you're pulling with Attila, the good faith and trust of your consumers is getting damn thin. So, I hope they don't do it. That might be a fool's hope, but, you know, optimism, yay. Anyways, let's actually move on before I just sit here whining for 20 hours about Creative Assembly's DLC policy. I figured I'd give you a bit of information on some of the more important locations of the Empire, so that you can get a bit more of an understanding of the Empire as a nation, rather than just, you know, how it works. So I figured I'd start off with one of the quite interesting things, namely the College of Magic. Now, in most human nations, magic is viewed as very, very, very dangerous, and therefore something to be made quite illegal indeed. Because, of course, untrained mages running around is a serious fire hazard. Not so much because the mage wanted to burn down the local tavern, but because, well, he couldn't control where his flames were shooting out from. The Empire, however, decided that instead of just essentially making this stuff illegal, why don't we actually offer them a license, so to say, where if they come to the Colleges of Magic in Altdorf, and if you submit yourself to training, testing, etc., then you can use magic. We'll use you within the Empire. You'll have civic duties. It's essentially a job. Like, you get your schooling or your tuition paid for you, and in return you offer your service in the Empire's armies, and as part of the Empire, as astrologers, as physicians, and as battle mages, etc. Now, it wasn't always so. The Colleges of Magic was essentially founded by the Emperor Magnus the Pious after the First Great War against Chaos, when he realized that, well, the crazy bastards up north is using plenty of magic, so to defend against that, we should probably start using some magic of our own. And so the Colleges of Magic were created. Now, they are divided into 8 different colleges, each corresponding to one of the 8 magical winds, each of which has a very different characteristic, and therefore different spells that can be used by drawing upon it. For example, you have the College of the Amber Order, the college which studies Gur, the lore of beasts. They're essentially druids, with a bunch of buffing spells, some nature spells, you know, manipulation of nature, and can summon animals, etc., that kind of stuff. And are used partially as battle mages, but they're also used to control some of the wilder, more forested areas of the Empire. Or the College of the Celestial Order, which studies Azir, the Lord of the Heavens. They are astrologists. They can see into the future, well, or at least they claim they can see into the future by studying the positions of the stars, etc., and they have several spells that draw upon celestial powers. Mostly used as battle mages, they also of course have a fair bit of use because, well, they can occasionally see the real future, and, well, that's always useful. And they are also exceptional astrologers, using charts and illustrations to map out extremely accurate maps of the stars, which aid in navigation, for example. And, of course, you have the Bright Order, which studies the wind of Ashik, the lore of fire, and, well, what you do with fire, you set people on fire with it. and they are one of the few orders that is essentially a purely battle magic order. The Bright Order have very little civic duties because, well, there are very, very, very few times indeed in which you just go like, hey, I would just love it to put that house on fire. You know, they don't have much real uses because while they can to some degree control fire, they can't actually put it out or stop it from spreading, so they're not really good at being firefighters either. Although they actually tried to make them into firefighters at some point. The problem is that most bright wizards, as they call themselves, being, you know, surrounded by fire and being taught about fire their entire lives, tend towards just a little bit of a pyromancy streak. And so, when you tell one of them to put out a fire, he might just decide that, you know, I don't want to put it out, it's just so pretty to look at. And that is, of course, the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the guy goes like, you know what, this city street needs more fire in it, and gets to work. But even though the colleges of magic present a pretty obvious danger to anyone living nearby from, you know, stray fireballs and the likes, it's still a hell of a lot safer than just having untrained magic users wandering the streets. And it shows that the Empire is a remarkably accepting nation, really. While most human nations either just enslave their magic users, or just, you know, kill them because witches and all that, the Empire actually takes a far more civilized view to it, and accepts its magic users for the danger and also the possible boon that they are, and train them in the workings of their art. This is also evident in my next little example, which is the city of Newlyn, which is home to the Imperial Gunnery School. Now, as the name might suggest, the Imperial Gunnery School is a place where they train artillerymen. And artillery being a key part of many Imperial armies, well-educated, trained, and disciplined crews, of course, come at a premium. And the teachers at the Imperial Gunnery School are the absolute best in the field. In fact, many of them are actually dwarves. And the dwarves have a particularly fine touch when it comes to the arts of black powder weaponry. As such, the gunners trained at the school are some of the finest in the world. Now, they can't quite match up to their dwarfish colleagues, but they are pretty damn good at what they do. And this excellent standard of training has led to an artillery corps that is not only capable of pointing their cannons in the rough direction of the enemy and firing off, but also to make accurate guesses of distance. They understand ballistics, they understand range, they understand how the weather might affect their projectiles. And as such, while the studies at the Imperial Gunnery School are considerably lengthy, they also produce extremely fine gunners. And while this has led to some problems simply because the teachers at the Imperial Gunnery School insist on maintaining their high standards, wanting to produce fewer but better gunners rather than large numbers of substandard graduates, has led to some severe lackage in artillery crews as the armies of the Empire grow ever bigger and required to deal with ever bigger threats. The demand for such gunner is ever increasing, but the output of such gunners stays more or less the same, as, like I said, the teachers aren't too keen on anyone else doing their job for them because they don't really trust anyone else, which is why there is only one Imperial Gunnery School, where there could be the need for several. So while the Empire is considerably more open to new ideas and innovation than most human nations, they still have some traditions that hinder them. Now, an interesting little note, I mentioned that the Empire is a very innovative nation. They allowed mages to be trained into proper mages, for example, as one of the first civilized nations in the old world. And they have produced many fantastic inventions, like the Hellblaster cannon, or the grenade-launching blunderbuss, for example. Something the dwarves, being much better at, well, cannons and general engineering, you would think, have not thought of. So why is that? Well, the reason is the dwarves really don't like new ideas, and so any invention within the Dwarven School of Engineering needs to be put through a prototype test stage that can last, well, a couple hundred years before actually being accepted as a working model. The Empire is far more lenient. But the ones that create these new inventions is not, in fact, the Imperial Gunnery School, but the College of Engineering, of which there are two. The well-known one in Altdorf, where the luminous one Meinkopf created the Hellblaster volley gun, and Fielmann, who invented the grenade-launching blunderbuss, along with some slightly less successful inventions, like, for example, the homing pigeon bomb, which was, well, exactly what it sounds like, a bomb strapped to a pigeon. Problem, of course, being that the homing pigeon didn't really understand what it was supposed to home in on, and so it flew a little distance, with the bomb fuse lit, of course, because, field testing, and then came right on back home, with predictable consequences. Or the slightly less expensive one in Newlyn. Once either college creates a war machine and it has gone through its basic testing stages and been accepted as a working model, the Imperial Gunnery School then starts training gunners to actually use it. Now, additionally, Newlyn is the primary forge of the Empire, where it creates most of its war machines and the vast majority of black powder weaponry. Although some other provinces have minor manufacturing points, like some provinces can create minor cannons, but they're not quite up to the quality of proper Newlyn-made cannons, and they can't hope to match the sheer output of Newlyn. And while the smaller handguns can be produced in many other places of the Empire, again, they're not up to quite the standard of Newland. And this has led Newlyn to adapt a very interesting fighting style quite unique to the rest of the Empire. While the rest of the Empire fights more along the lines of a Renaissance-era nation, Newlyn fights more in a pike and shot kind of way, using units of solid, heavily armored pikemen flanked by units of handgunners supported by mass amounts of artillery. Far more comparable to the English Civil War between the parliamentary Roundheads and the Royalist Chevaliers than the Renaissance style of warfare preferred by the vast majority of the Empire. Speaking of the Empire's armies, I'm probably not going to do a tactics video on the Empire. In fact, I'm almost certain I'm not going to do it. And I'm saying almost because, well, my mind wanders, and I might suddenly find a good reason to actually do it, but don't hold your breath. I'll talk a little bit about the Imperial Army in general here. First and foremost, why would you actually want to play the Empire in tabletop or in Total War? Well, it's because they're so incredibly versatile. Being just humans, they have access to a wide variety of tactics that might not suit many of the other races. For example, you're never really going to have a proper ranged heavy orc army, just as you're never going to have a proper melee-ish Wood Elf army, for example. For those of you who don't know, the Wood Elves primarily rely on bows and light-ranged weaponry, though very little artillery, or in fact any artillery, rather than actually getting stuck in melee. You could technically kinda make a full-on melee Wood Elf army, but it requires a little bit of fluff bending, shall we just say. The Empire, however, has a huge amount of flexibility in this. You can have an armies of disciplined blocks of professional soldiers supported by citizen militia, backed up by some crossbowmen and archers in a very early Renaissance style. Or you can have grand artillery batteries provided by the city of Newlyn, where you have essentially pike and shot formations with tons of cannons and mortars at the backs. Or you can have an army almost entirely made up of the various knightly orders, which I'll cover in slightly more detail in a bit. or you can have extremely heavy magic armies. In fact, the Empire is capable of doing magic artillery to an extent that is only really matched by the Skavens or the High Elves. And they can also be extremely magically defensive, being able to take enough wizards to really screw with any attempts by the opposition to actually get their magical barrage going. You can also do a far more ad hoc army from one of the poorer provinces, with very little in the way of artillery and no black powder weapons, so essentially they're relying entirely on crossbows and bows, with units of professional soldiers paid and capped by the local lord, supported heavily by citizen militia and light outrider cavalry. Or you can do one of the wealthy provinces' armies like Reichland, with tons of professional, disciplined, extremely well-equipped soldiers, wearing half-plate, equipped with beautifully crafted halberds, supported by professional marksmen armed with crossbows, handguns, with artillery parks at their backs, with knightly orders on their flanks, and elite outriders with repeater pistols to fill the skirmishing role. All of these things are possible within the Empire. And, of course, the Empire just looks good on the tabletop, and I hope they will in Total War as well. Now, again, if you're going to be limited to one army, you're going to be a little bit more limited in your color schematic. But if they do the Empire as one nation, it could be beautiful. You could have all manners of different provinces all gathered up in one army, in this big, beautiful army with all kinds of colors and different patterns, etc. I've already mentioned this, I know, but I really like the idea of that. Now, due to the simple fact that they're humans, most Imperial armies rely on somewhat the same tactics. They prefer to be able to deploy in solid blocks of infantry and take a bit of a defensive role, where they can hold off the enemy and pound them at range with various ranged units. You can make a very offensive, attacky Empire army, it's perfectly possible, but because they're so good at everything, they're not going to be so good at individual things as armies that are properly geared towards it. A very attacky Empire army based almost entirely around melee combat is going to be absolutely stomped on by Chaos, for example, and an all-ranged army, while probably being the most viable all-out solution for the Empire, is still just simply going to get outshot by the Wood Elves. So, really, the key here is combined arms, which is another thing that I just love about the Imperial Army. It really, really rewards you for planning ahead. It's less of a case of scissors beat paper, and more of a case of beating their scissor with your rock while protecting your paper, if you get my drift. Now, I've already mentioned the Colleges of Magic, so instead of talking more about magic, I thought I'd give you a quick little look into the Knightly Orders, because that's also a very interesting part of Empire society. Many prominent noblemen send their sons off to serve inside these Knightly Orders, to gain themselves position, fame, power, all of these things. As, of course, having a prominent member of a knightly order in the family boosts the family's prestige considerably. Now, some of the most famous knightly orders are so-called Templar orders. They are dedicated essentially to one god or another. Now, like I said, the Empire is a fairly accepting nation with several gods. So, for example, you have the Knights of the White Wolf, which are ferocious followers of Ulrich, the god of war. Primarily based up in Middenland, they maintain their order fortress in Middenheim. And quite different from most other knightly orders, they follow Ulrich more in their knightly traditions, and as such they go into battle carrying great two-handed cavalry hammers, and they do not wear helmets. So they've got considerably less of a charge impact than heavy lance cavalry. However, those big-ass hammers are damn good for taking down powerful elite units or monsters. They also have a sub-faction in the Teutogan Guard, the bodyguard of the cult of Ulrich's religious leader, the Ar Ulrich, which fight on foot to protect him. They are essentially drawn from the more prominent members of the Knight of the White Wolf, and is mostly considered a ceremonial detail, though they are most definitively no slouches in actual combat either. Then you've got a really interesting one that shows just how accepting the Empire can actually be. It's the Knights of the Blazing Sun. They follow the war goddess Myrmidon, which is not an imperial god at all. It is in fact an Estelian god, and therefore it is considered one of the civilized gods, yes, but it's not a common god in the Empire, and the fact that a knightly order is even allowed to worship a foreign god is quite remarkable. Now, the backstory to this is quite long, so I won't recount all of it. Essentially, during a war with another human nation named Araby, the Knights of the Blazing Sun were aiding the Estelians in the recapture of one of their cities, and in this city was a temple to the god Myrmidon. The knightly order was overwhelmed by a particularly vicious Arabian warlord named Emir Vazir the Cruel, and they looked set to overwhelm the knights and butcher them to the last man, when a freak earthquake shook the temple, dislodging the huge bronze statue of Myrmidon atop the building and sending it crashing to the ground, where it crushed Emir Vazir the Cruel and the majority of his soldiers. The leaderless Arabian horde thereby abandoned the temple to the knights, and ever since that day the knights have decided that, well, the goddess clearly interceded on their behalf, and as such it's only right and proper that they pay back the favour. And they have since established themselves as one of the more prominent and honourable noble orders within the Empire. Additionally, of course, they just look kick-ass. Now, an example of a non-Templar order is the Knights Panther. The Knights Panther is one of the most famous and most prestigious orders within the Empire, and they dedicated themselves to the preservation of purity in the human form. Now, with purity, I'm not talking racial superiority or any such other nonsense a la our own wonderful history. Rather, they're fighting against the corruption of chaos. So it's not that they dislike people of a certain religious persuasion or a certain skin color, they just really don't like mutants, and are fanatically devoted to hunting them down. Now, this fanatical conviction has also caused some minor quirks within their organization. For example, while most knightly orders will head north to support their cousins at Kislev, whenever they're being attacked by the Chaos Hordes to the north, the Knights Panthers' first and foremost loyalty is to the Empire, and therefore send very few forces up north, considering themselves more of a policing force within the Empire, working for the Empire's protection rather than anyone else's. The simple fact that should Kislev fall, then the Empire will surely be next on Chaos' to-do list doesn't really concern them that much. And their origins story, so to say, is also based upon the War of Araby, though not by any divine intervention. They simply took a liking to all of the cool animals down there and brought several of them along with them back to the Empire at the end of the war. And these days, they usually drape themselves with whatever exotic animal pelts they can come across. And so, while they call themselves the Knight Panther, there are several knights that decorate themselves with leopards, for example, or lions, etc., rather than the panther of their name. Then, lastly, you have the Reichsguard. The Reichsguard is not a Templar order, nor are they a private secular order. They are their own military order, based around the protection of the Emperor. They are essentially his bodyguards, or, well, they're more than that. I think the closest comparison, although a somewhat horrible one, is Adolf Hitler's Leibstandarte during World War II. as while they are technically ceremonial bodyguards, they also fulfilled a battlefield role. The Reichsguards, in the same vein, are technically the ceremonial bodyguards of the Emperor, but they are also a considerably sized military order, and will take part in many of the Empire's campaigns. And they are also responsible for the security of all palaces and all castles belonging to the imperial family. And they are divided into a mounted arm known as the Reichsguards Knights or Imperial Cavalry, and an infantry arm, the Imperial Foot. And although the Imperial Foot does not have quite the glorious imagery of their shining knights on horseback, they are nonetheless some of the finest fighters within the Empire, recruited as they are not purely from the sons of nobility, but from the absolute cream of the Empire's fighting crop. Though that might mislead you into thinking that the Reichsguard will take anyone, not quite so. They do restrict their recruitment to the sons of nobility, though they don't have to be direct descendants, so technically, with a little bit of fudging in the paperwork, a particularly promising bastard of a noble family could be accepted, and there has been on occasion acceptance of technically lowborns, although they've essentially just been given some random noble title to justify their joining. Although I stress that that is extremely rare. And this is mostly due to the sheer prestige of being a member of the Reichsguard. Being a member of the Reichsguard, just being a simple member, is essentially the equal in prestige to being the commander of armies of local provinces. They are considered to be the finest fighting force within the Empire, and therefore the men who make up its rank are considered to be the finest amongst nobility. And therefore they are also afforded some of the finest equipment within the Empire, while most knightly orders will equip its members to a considerable degree, wearing exquisitely crafted full-plate armor. The armor of the Reichsguard is particularly fine, comparable to that of extreme late-age medieval European history, where suits of armor was constructed with such ingenious design and use of rounded curves and interlocking plates as to be nearly impenetrable. And even just a single suit of such armor would cost thousands upon thousands of crowns. Crowns being the standard currency of the Empire. They have pretty much a normal currency system, unlike many of the other races. They trade in gold, silver, copper, etc. And not only would it cost an absolutely ridiculous amount, it would also take months, if not years, to complete. Finally, a note on the Empire's relations with its neighbors. The Empire has essentially always been allied with the dwarves. There are bonds of loyalty between men and dwarf that stretch back all the way to Sigmar's time, and the two can usually rely on one another to come to the other's aid if so required. They also have looser alliances with the High Elves of Ulthuan. And though these are mostly alliances of, just common benefit, e.g. they'll march off to war together to fight the Chaos Hordes, for example, simply because, well, if the Kislev and the Empire gets overrun, again, the High Elves are probably next up on the shit list. And they are also, well, allied with Bretonnia is a very, very strong word. They're friendly-ish. They've been at war many, many, many times, yes, but when threatened by greenskins or by chaos, for example, or particularly large concentrations of beastmen, they can usually be relied upon to find enough common ground to stop stabbing each other and go off to fight the common enemy. As to their relations with the other human nations, like the Border Princes, Estelia, Telia, and Arabe, well, they're reasonably friendly with Estelia and Telia, having merchant relations with both of them, if not outright alliances. And when it comes to Arabe, well, They've been at war with them several times, but at this point, Araby is so far away that it's mostly a live and let live policy. And then there's Kislev, of course, to the north. Now, Kislev doesn't technically have a proper army within Warhammer Fantasy. They are a very well fleshed out nation, to the point where I'm probably going to do a video on them at some point, though I can't say when. But essentially, the short version is that Kislev is a human nation that is very, very close to the borders of the Chaos Wastes, and as such, whenever the angry little Chaos-worshipping bastards up north start moving south, Kislev is always the ones who get the brunt of the bastardry. And Kislev itself, being a fairly poor country of large steppes and very little fertile ground, you could kind of compare it to Siberian Russia. Doesn't really stand much of a chance of beating off major Chaos invasions by themselves, although they have pulled off some absolute miracle victories by themselves during the course of their history. And as such, most of the civilized nations of the world will march to Kislev's aid, because, again, much better that Kislev eat the majority of the brunt and the Chaos invasion gets stopped up there, rather than them starting to roll into the proper civilized lands of the south. And as such, the Empire has strong bonds of alliances with Kislev, to the point where Kislev can almost be guaranteed. In fact, I'd go so far as that it can be guaranteed Imperial support in the case of a Chaos invasion. And while the dwarves can be reasonably sure of aid, that somewhat depends on which local imperial noble they decide to go asking for help, and, well, dwarves don't really go ask for help in the most diplomatic of manners, let's just say. Well, I have rambled on for quite long enough, I think. So, I hope you've liked this video, I hope it has been informative, and I hope to see you in the Empire Army video, which is also going to be quite considerable because, well, the Empire's got a lot of units to go through. But nevertheless, I hope to see you then. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.